All right. Thank you all for joining us. I'm so excited to have you all here. I'm so thankful to Kevin. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us.
You're welcome.
And I will just ask everyone to put themselves on mute. I'd like to remind you that we're recording this meeting today, and it will be publicly available on YouTube going forward. So that's just for your information. And I'm going to start by acknowledging that the place where the Clay Studio stands now and where it will stand in the future is part of the traditional land of the Lenni Lenape. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief Tamanend, that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. And now I'd like to introduce Kevin Snipes, although I have a feeling most of you know him and his work pretty well. Kevin Snipes is an American artist born in Philadelphia, raised in Cleveland, Ohio. He earned a BFA in ceramics and drawing from the Cleveland Institute of Art and concluded graduate studies at the University of Florida in 2003. He works primarily in ceramics, blurring the boundaries between craft and art. Snipes combines techniques of narrative figure drawing, text, and hand-formed porcelain constructions to create objects that can be seen as multi-layered paintings. Kevin has participated in many artist residency programs, often maintaining an itinerant existence. Through both national and international residencies, including the Clay Studio, Watershed Center for Ceramic Art, Wesleyan College in Georgia, he's allowed a sense of place to augment his sense of identity and contribute to the dialogue of his work. He has exhibited nationally and internationally, including recent solo exhibitions at the Conklin Gallery in Minnesota and Plinth Gallery in Denver. So I wanted to start the conversation with Kevin by asking a little bit about that idea of being an itinerant artist, thinking of yourself that way, and what brought you here back, I'll say, to Philadelphia and here to the Clay Studio.
Right. Yeah. So I feel like pretty excited about being in Philadelphia, and I was born here, and so I have memories of driving from Cleveland, Ohio, to Philadelphia throughout my childhood, visiting grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, and so I've been traveling around a lot and have completely lost the sense of having a community, I feel like, which is a very strange thing. I have friends all over the world, and but I don't really have a sense of having a community of my own anymore because I've been traveling so much. So I was thinking that's kind of problematic, and but that's something that should actually work on. So I was trying to just figure out where that should be, and I was thinking possibly North Carolina because I love trees. I've always loved trees since I was a kid. And I have a lot of friends in North Carolina. But in actuality, I think that, as an artist, North Carolina is not a really great place for my art. It's a great place for maybe my spirit to be. But as far as being an artist, which is my primary concern in life, because I don't have, children or pets even, because I'm highly allergic to cats. um, so my focus in life is my artwork, and so Philadelphia seemed like a great place to develop a sense of community and to develop my artwork and have a sense of that's train distance from New York City, galleries. There's so many great things about Philly. I don't have to list them. I feel like, but I'm excited about post-pandemic living where I can actually feel like I'm actually in Philly, which I don't really feel like I'm actually here now. I've not been any place besides the studio in my apartment and takeout restaurants.
Yeah, it's so hard. And it was, when we talked, when you were coming into the program, was still a moment, I think, when we imagined that the pandemic wouldn't last as long as it has.
Right. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and you really did talk a lot about sort of diving into the community and being very intentional about using the Clay Studios resources um, that already exist in the community to allow you to achieve that goal. And it's been frustrating not to be able to get there, but and my internal Pollyanna sensibility thinks like, okay, well, when it does come back soon, it'll just be so much more appreciated, and there's not going to
Yeah.
be any time wasting. Like, just gonna get right on it.
Well, I feel a little bit nervous actually about the pandemic going away, because I feel like it's going to be culture shock. I'm typically kind of a more of a shy person, and I feel like it's going to be overwhelming for me to suddenly be able to do things. Like I'm going to initially want to just hide away in my apartment and not do things. I think for a little bit before I get used to the idea of being able to actually interact with people.
Yeah, I don't think enough. Not to say that we need something else to worry about, but I haven't heard that conversation too much in the public sphere. And as a gregarious person, I kind of have that worry as well, because I've learned to live within a very small sphere in the last year,
Mhm.
and I think it's going to be uncomfortable for all of us. Um, Maybe, in fact,
Yeah, I think
being
that's a really interesting question. I mean, just like not even concerning art, art, but all of us will have to readjust ourselves to a new way of life, which is the old normal, which will no longer be normal anymore. Um,
yeah,
will it be like one big orgy, for instance, or will it be
of
like
of artwork, maybe.
well, I'm exaggerating, but like is it going to be like like a big group hug that society's going to just like be like really thrilled to be able to like shake hands again, um,
I
or
don't.
what?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine that it's going to come back so slowly that that won't really ever be the case, and psychologically we're going to be worried about it for a long time. But maybe as an introvert you're more skilled to handle it than people who are kind of used to being all or nothing. I don't know, that's my Pollyanna again. I just want to pause for 1 second and remind everyone that if you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat and we will address them. um I think when we talked about preparing for this, I said I might ask you that standard question that I've been asking at Lunch and Learns, which is what how did you make the brave decision to make your life an art? But I think after our conversation the other day, I think right now it's how did you talk about the brave decisions you want to make now going forward, which is tied into what we're talking about. I know you've been doing some future planning. So I think everybody would be interested to hear what your imagined future kind of looks like, if you want to share that with people. And
um, well, I think it's really interesting. I mean, the whole idea about bravery. I think that in art there is a lot of fear, um, and like I think a lot of people who are artists, there's this tendency to fear like messing up your artwork, or like really putting yourself into your art is a challenging thing. And so I, and there's even a book called Art and Fear, that I read a long time ago. Um, but as far as my own steps, I feel like there are things that I have been sort of afraid to do in my career, and part of there's a mixture of things. Part of it's financial, not kind of living sort of at the poverty level for a long time, just making art, and um, and part of it is so just having the resources to do something um, really challenging. And I've kind of always imagined making like public scale work, like really giant work. I don't know what it looks like, but I would love to make work that's like outdoor or public space work sometime in the future. But I think that I've always been afraid to even approach that, just because it's like it's a lot of clay, it's a lot of time, so many things that sort of make it a challenge. And I I know how to make small work, and so that's sort of a comfort place. And so I think that it's really interesting to think about artists. I always believe that artists are empowered to take risk and to do things that other professions can't really do. Like if you have a like you said, example of a dentist. You don't really want your dentist to actually do experiments on you and take risk. But if you're an artist, you can do kind of crazy stuff and make ugly art and challenge yourself to really do things that feel uncomfortable. And so I'm always trying to remind myself that like how do you push yourself to be in that uncomfortable place and actually feel comfortable in that uncomfortable place. Um, and I think that's part of existing and like being a shy person and traveling and putting my body into new situations, especially being an African American. Like a lot of my life has been in non-African American spaces. So I feel like just my existence has been sort of an experiment in a way. um, am I
Yeah.
rambling?
No, I think everything you said was extremely succinct and clear and powerful. I think that that last point should not be taken lightly, that it's just, putting yourself in these situations requires bravery in itself. And that there's that constant negotiating between fear and bravery in different aspects of your life, whether they are artistic or kind of social, is important to know that you're kind of like always living in that space. And you said this you know incredibly also true thing that I don't think people realize enough, which is that artists are empowered, or they should feel empowered to take risks. And it's that flip side of this question that I've been asking about how artists have made that brave decision. But the fact that I had never thought about that idea that other fields, other careers are not asked to be brave.
Right.
Or to take risks, I should say. They maybe are brave in different ways, but to think um, in new and different ways, and like always be trying something new, which is what an artist is asked to do.
Right. And I think that's really one of the important things about art in our society, like why we have artists and art in our society, is because it does push us outside of the normal living. I mean, if we just went to work and did our jobs every day, life would be pretty boring. So we really need someone out there making these crazy music and, like performances and art objects to really get our brains outside of the everyday life.
Yeah.
Um,
And that maybe ironic is not the right word, but another layer of interest there is, although artists are on the avant-garde and they're pushing the boundaries and asked to challenge society, when you look back as an art historian, I often think about, I'm really interested in looking back at art to understand that culture better. So I'm looking at art as a reference to the culture, whereas during the moment, the artists are the ones who are kind of pushing forward. But it is in those spaces of newness that you can really understand, I think, what the general society was thinking about, because it's like you don't need a rule unless somebody's been breaking that rule. So
right.
the new space of the art is actually defining what the norm is that's kind of behind it.
Well, I think society is always changing, and I think that artists are always responding to whatever society's doing. So they're bound together. It's not like artists are just on their own planet. Like we have terms like modernism and postmodernism, and those are things that are as artists we think of those things as art terms, but they're really not art terms. They're societal terms. So all of society is kind of like our American society. For instance, modernism was really strong in the 50s. And one of the key elements of modernism was sort of this singular vision of, universality, which was kind of a white male vision of the world. And, like 1950s was, really great if you were a white man, and it's sort of idyllic. But if you were anyone else, you weren't really part of that vision. So, life wasn't quite so great. And then postmodernism is sort of the representation of many different voices. So it's, art reflects those things, by becoming, multi-voiced. And then we have, I guess we're sort of in a postmodern time now where, anyway, art history is really interesting. But one of the things that I'm also really excited about being in Philadelphia is that, being a Black person, I really don't know that many Black people. And I was really hoping that this would be my chance to have a lot of Black friends, which is kind of a weird thing to say, being a Black person. So I think that, like one of the things that I've noticed in my life is that I've done a lot of lecturing, and often I've gone to universities and lectured, and I've talked about, looking at the people in the lecture hall, like that I'm lecturing to, and like rarely having Black people in the audience. And so I've noticed that what that means is that the people in the audience are having more of a African American experience than I am, because I'm not seeing any African Americans in front of me, where they're looking at me kind of as a representation of being an African American person, which is really weird kind of realization that, that's sort of my life. And so, Philadelphia is so diverse, and I'm, I'm hoping to kind of find a place where I feel comfortable around all different types of people. I don't know if I really said that right, but you know what I mean.
I mean,
Um,
again, I think you said it perfectly, and I hope that, especially with the pandemic ending and our move, and that you're on our Making Place Matter Council, which is we have this idea of everybody being together as a pretty forefronted goal at this point, and I hope that we can achieve that. And I'm hoping that your desire is also fulfilled. It's just going to take a
yeah,
bit longer, perhaps, with this. We can't
I'm
go hang out
also
with people.
I'm astounded by how much hate there is in the world. I mean, just with the attacks against Asian American people recently, um, I'm just, I'm kind of heartbroken about how much hatred we have in the world, and I don't understand it. I wasn't brought up that way, and so I don't have a perspective on how people can be so hateful, and you know what does it mean, and how do we address that? It's um,
It,
you know
it seems to be so
also
much
even
more forefronted right now as well. I mean, like it's
right.
always been there, but it was a there was a veneer, whether it was a false veneer or not, in like the mainstream, that seems to have been torn away over the last few years.
Yeah. So anyway, getting to the artwork.
Yeah, that's fine. So,
um,
how about if I share my screen so people can see your show?
yeah.
Okay.
So this exhibition that I've created is it's relating to all these things that we're talking about right now. These are pieces that um, are all kind of, they're plates, but they're face plates, and they are, typically in my work, I represent different um, types of people, but I don't color them in, so that they are just the color of the clay. Um, and it's sort of intentional in some ways, but it's also comes just from an history that I have of um, doing comics as a kid, and kind of black and white comics. And so, when in art school, I decided that I wanted to like get away from the comic thing, and so I did a lot of classical, like Michelangelo type drawing and painting, more drawing. Uh, and I but then when I started doing ceramics, I and wanted to put the figure onto clay. It was really awkward trying to do a realistic figure on clay. I just felt like it just wasn't working, and so I kind of went back to my cartooning days and made decided to kind of represent the figure in a way that could be distorted and abstracted to fit onto the forms of the clay. Um, and I guess next slide.
Okay. I would love
So
to see one of those old pots with a Michelangelo type drawing on it, but go ahead.
yeah, it didn't last very long. I mean, it was really awkward. It was undergraduate school, and honestly, like my first experience with clay, I didn't want to draw on it. I think the very first thing I did made in clay, I drew on it, and I was like, "This is great." And then I wanted to really explore form, so um, I did really simple kind of surfaces with complex forms, really just trying to learn about clay and vessels and forms. And but I always wanted, like for years I did that. I didn't draw on clay at all for a number of years. And I was also kind of self-taught. Before I went to undergraduate school, I was actually like a college dropout at a different college, and um, interestingly, I took one class in clay, and then I got this job at a community college mixing clay and glazes, and so I kind of just taught myself how to make stuff on a wheel. And so I always, I used to tell people all the time that I learned how to do clay on the street, uh, because I really was sort of had to kind of just absorb a lot of stuff on my own. So anyway, this exhibition is a lot about looking and being looked at. So the idea of um, um, like I don't want to say racism necessarily, but the idea of otherness and the idea of people seeming to be different because of their exterior. So this show, what I'm trying to do is ideally, if you go into the gallery and you're looking at the work, then your body becomes part of the exhibition, where the work is actually looking back at you. And so there is this sort of sense of like the like being looked at by the artwork as well as you looking at the artwork. And basically in my ceramic work, like I do that with multiple sides of a piece where there's more than one character on different sides. And so so with the face plates, there's only one face, so then I'm really trying to push this idea that the viewer becomes the other person in the artwork. And I don't know if it really works or not. It's sort of one of those things that's, like it's a challenge. It's like it's experiment where I'm, pushing boundaries a little bit for myself.
And
Um,
I think that ties so perfectly into what you just said before about being, speaking and kind of looking out and into a sea of white faces and feeling, in that kind of situation that you're so much being looked at. And honestly, it worked. The reason why, yes, it does work is because there's so many different layers of meaning
Truth. Yeah.
and truth. But we
I
could ask about the tears, but we can also talk about the eyes, and that ties right into the looking and being looked at. But I also just want to note that during all of this, when we've been talking about your show and talking about your desire to be within a community here in Philadelphia, when you first told me about the show, you said, I want it to be like filled with faces and people to me, my first thought was like, oh, he wants his community. Like he hasn't found it yet in real life. So we're just going to put it on the walls. And then, I mean, you're, that's such a simplified view of what it is, but I think it still exists underneath there. But I see there, your other layers of meaning are,
Well, that's true. I mean, I feel like, I do a lot of thinking, and probably way too much thinking for my own good. But so there's lots of layers to my work, and one layer that I'm constantly reminding myself of is, no matter, like, what I'm making, I want to have a sense of wonderment, childlike wonderment. Um, so in some ways, I think of ceramics as toys, but for adults. Like, if you think about, like, your favorite toy as a child, and that intimacy, that space in between you and the toy was like this really great little thing that you had that you just loved. And there was almost sort of this conversation, you talk to your teddy bear or whatever. And so I try to bring a little bit of that into my work, sort of magic, child wonderment, maybe you call it. Um, and um, and I don't know if it really works or not for people, but that's sort of like my intention, is to kind of imbue the work with that sensibility. Um,
they have that sense of that a doll or a stuffed animal that you look into its eyes, because each of, these these faces are looking at you, and they have such a sense of um, presence, that there is something going on. Like you feel this plate looking at you. You think it's really it has life in it. And
yeah.
not to be
Well,
too
one of my
personal, but the fact that this is called Rainbow Bright, and you just talked about the intimacy of dolls. My Rainbow Bright doll was like one of my favorites. But anyway, go ahead.
oh, right. Yeah. Actually, it was a suggestion, and that name, and I remembered my sisters had Rainbow Bright. Like, I would not have even thought of Rainbow Bright, but it's like, yeah, it seemed perfect. Um, but one of the things that was, with the show, about the presence of the viewer's body, is that I wanted the pieces to be high enough on the wall where it felt like the viewer was a child, and these were almost like adults looking down at the child. Um, and um, that's sort of my intention. And I think that that's probably, next time I do this show, which I do intend to have like another version of the show. I think the pieces will be a little bigger, and um, sort of encompass that sense of, like, kind of, you know, these are like these big figures that are kind of leaning over you and kind of looking down at you, almost like um, Viola Fry, sculptress work,
Yeah.
that are these giant figures that are kind of hovering above you. Um,
Well, and that's related to this idea of taking up space too. I think,
mhm,
as um, in your reference to being oftentimes the only Black person in the room, that you are, if you have larger things and you're wanting these figures to be taking up the right amount of space, or like a big space, to kind of address that um, disparity. And I'll just add, how about if you just make a big figure sculpture like Viola Fry, life-sized? I'm going to challenge you to think about that.
mm, okay.
um, and I think I want to tell people this story. Well, we can come back and talk about these pieces in detail, but since you just talked about children and being in the space and at the viewing level of a child, there was just this wonderful thing that happened while we were installing the exhibition, was that, which doesn't happen that much because there aren't that many people walking into the gallery, but a family came in, or a group of adults and children, and the kids were so interested. All your plates were sitting out on the table waiting to go up. And, you know, I sort of started engaging them and asking them questions, but kids are fearless, speaking of fear. And
Mm,
they were like, well, why do they have so many eyes? They just went right for that question and
Right.
wanted to know all about it. And we told them you were going to be painting on the wall, and then you just started painting for them, and they were just raptured. It was a really special moment.
Maybe
Um,
especially because it's painting on the wall, which is usually a no-no. Children.
yeah, I think you even said to them, like, now don't do this at your own house. Um, but you gave them a little lesson, because you said you can draw anything you want and then you can just wipe it off, but you don't have to worry that it's perfect. And I just try. And it was actually like this beautiful little life and
Mhm.
art lesson for those kids.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was a group of different kids. I mean, they all seemed kind of like they were different. So I don't think it was a family necessarily. Maybe it was a class or something.
Yeah,
I
but
don't know.
I don't know. I wasn't sure either. It was some family and some class of some kind.
Yeah.
It was pretty special. I don't know if there's a
Yeah.
question in there for you. Just wanted everyone else to see this lovely
Hmm.
interaction. Um, so I'm gonna look to see if there are any questions in the chat, and then we can go back to talking about details. I know that Joe Blank asked about bicycle imagery. Let me get back to that one.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, please ask questions. I feel like this is sort of a casual conversation, and I haven't really planned out a formal lecture.
Yeah.
So
So can you talk
w-
about the appearance of a bicycle in many of your artworks?
yeah, so I used I'm very attached to bicycles. I my first uh, bicycle, like, well, I had a tricycle, but my first real bicycle was this great red bicycle with a banana seat, and it's really cool. And the astounding thing about having that bike when I was, I don't know how old, maybe like six or something, six, seven, was that for the first time in my life, I felt like I could like be an adventurer. I could be a traveler, go out and like distances and kind of have my own power of travel. And it was a really exciting feeling. I remember that. And then after I had the bike for several months, like some big kids kind of stole it from me. They beat me up. They ganged up on me. These two big kids, and stole the bike, and so it was pretty upsetting. Um, which like once again, like you take risks in life and you go out and you be an adventurer, then you can easily, uh, you know, you have to deal with fear that way too. Um, but later on, I became a bicycle mechanic as a teenager, and my best friend and I did some long distance bicycling. We actually would go like on the weekends. We would bike for do a 20 or 40 mile bike ride, and then we went biking through the mountains of Vermont and New Hampshire, through the White Mountains and Green Mountains, and doing like the longest day was 100 miles, um, or I think it was actually 99 miles. We missed the 100 mile mark by like 1 mile or something, because we reached our destination. We're like, oh, should we go around the block or something? Or like, no, we're by that
Tired.
time. Um, but so I didn't actually have a car until I was like 30, and I would just bike everywhere. So I was very attached to bike, and just sort of that as a way of transportation. Um, so I've had a really long history with bicycles, um, and I think that in my work with more than one person on it, there's a sense of not only looking and being looked at, but there's also a sense of uh, like chasing and being chased, or not really maybe chasing, but like this sort of idea of wanting to become attached, or like attachment and disattachment. And so there's like this sense of traveling away from or traveling towards. So people on the bicycles, they're trying to get to the other side of the piece where the other person is. They're not always on bicycles, but there could be running sometimes, or there's that feeling of like they're trying to meet the other person but they're also trying to run away from the other person at the same time. There's that tension between like um, attraction and repulsion that happens when um,
There's
um,
there's often a very the energy of romantic relationship, on your pots to me as I turn them around and thinking about that's the stories that you make up in your head as you're looking at them. Like, is this person going
maybe
towards the next
you're a romantic
person or
person.
trying to get away from them? What? Which
Maybe
is
that's your vibe.
maybe, but I mean, they're men and women and they're sort of like chasing each other
Yeah,
around.
right.
I don't think it's too
Well,
much.
yeah.
I'm not
Well,
sure that I'm the only one, I guess is my point.
I'm sorry, I'm just teasing you
Right.
on
Totally
public television. Anyway, no, I try to leave enough room in my narratives so that people can interpret the way they want to. And sometimes I think that so I do try to be suggestive, but I try not to be implicit in that suggestion, so that there's room for um, creating a bigger narrative by the viewer imbuing the piece with their own history. And I think that occurred to me quite a long time ago, um, almost by accident, when I realized that you know someone who bought a piece of mine who I didn't know, um, from a holiday sale. It was like December, and this woman bought this piece, and she came back at the next holiday sale a year later, and she was like, Kevin, I figured it out. And she told me this really interesting story about the narrative of the piece. And she was like, this guy is saying this because she's saying this. And sometimes what I do is I'll put like word search on the sides of the piece where there's all these kind of mixtures of letters and you can sort of find words in there. And so she had found this text that sort of hit the secret text that they were messaging between the two characters. And she was really excited about me telling me this, that she figured it out. And I love that. I think that um, what it means is that the piece was alive in some ways. Like, it wasn't static. Like, she took it home, and it was one thing when she took it home, but then the day it was something else, and then it kept changing in her mind because she kept realizing that there was more to it. More, the layers kept revealing themselves. And then, honestly, what her narrative had nothing to do with the narrative that I had been thinking about when I made it. But I think that's like that. I think that's just the way that art is. Like, once you let the object out into the world, um, it it's no longer the artist's work anymore. It becomes the owner's work, and they can imbue it the way they want to. And I think that's true with all artwork, except for possibly political artwork, which is very, like, concrete. This is, what I'm trying to say. And, um, and art, there's different types of art, and every type of art has its purpose, but I think that, um, some art has the ability to have that sense of space for the viewer more than others. And I love having that sense of space. I think that's sort of a magicness where the work becomes bigger than it actually is, uh, conceptually and emotionally and all those things.
Yeah, it's
Um,
universal.
well, it's universal by being very personal. It couldn't be universal except that it is very personal. Like, it has a specificness that um, I think universality is kind of a tricky thing with art. If you're trying to be universal, it usually means that you're making something that is totally boring and totally generic. And it's the only way to really get to, as a someone who writes novels, for instance, the only way to really get to a universality is by making something really personal, telling a personal story. So it's a tricky word.
It is a tricky
Um,
word. And when you said that, I think I remembered us having this conversation before because
yeah,
it sounds familiar, unless I'm just having deja vu. But to me,
yeah,
universal means like that it's not boring and broad, but that it's able to, each person who looks at it sees what they, is able to see their own truth.
Hmm. I think a lot of young artists think I want to make artwork that everyone's going to like, and that means universal. So they make something that is, so like sugary and like nothingness that it doesn't really feel like anything.
Yeah, I think
And so
that
no,
word for you triggers like pedestrian or bland or
yeah,
weak or something, which I think we have different views of what the word means, but
right,
I hear what you're saying.
yeah.
I think we had somebody who asked about the title of the show. Nicola, who is from Ontario, said, there are always so many connecting ideas embedded in a body of work. Finding the center for a title is important. Can you please explain the choice of and meaning of is not?
Well, I guess like part like um there's different things, and I wanted once again to leave the title so that it has this sort of mystery and openness to it, and ability to be interpreted by different people in different ways. Um, but there's a few things like like one thing that is childhood sayings, like like I can remember like my sisters and I arguing, um, that's sort of like something kids would say, like, no, it's not. Yes, it is. That kind of thing, back and forth. And but also just the idea of black and white, kind of opposites. Like that are not really opposites. Um, like I think that a lot of things I talk about in my work is that like um, like not coloring in the figures. I really have a um, you know, in some ways, I really struggle with this idea. Being an artist and being someone who's really into color theory, for instance, I have a hard time with people actually being called white or black. You know, I think there's no one who's really white or black. These two pieces on the screen, they're white and black. But if your skin color was that, it would be pretty creepy. Um, but we use these terms that aren't really accurate to describe people's skin color. And the fact that in the 21st century that we are actually concerned with people's skin color as a way of recognizing who they are is almost barbaric. Um, and so I kind of in my head I kind of think about those sort of things, and um, you know colored people, and just sort of the different terms that um, you know I really do believe, for instance, that like the term white as a white person is a sense of like Christianity. Like there's a lot of religious overtones in that. Like the sense of people adopting the term white to call themselves has a lot to do with this idea of like white is pure and Christian, and and black is sort of evil, and like, and those terms like come from slavery, and like kind of having this sense of separation of like people, like having a sense of like who's the boss and who's the slave, like, and so it really does like in our this age of like worldwide connection between with internet and things, it seems like so barbaric to me that we're still in this place where we are um, referring to people as like black and white. um,
Yeah,
Anyway.
it's, as you're saying, it's doesn't, it oversimplifies and doesn't do justice to anyone really, to, and it's not helping. It's not helping. So those are not the ways that we need to talk about it. It's hard. It's hard. Naming things and categorizing things is such a human tendency and kind of need in a way in order to understand our world. But then you have to take a step back and realize what the naming and the categorizing has wrought and try to
Hmm.
go in the other
Yeah.
direction. Um, so I want to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the pieces that I've just been driving by here. Is there, in the 5 minutes that we have left, is there one particular piece? This one is one of the most striking ones to me in the show. But do you want to talk about this one, or is there another one that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that a lot of this work is made intuitively, and I've gotten to the point where I try to trust my um, ability to make intuitive decisions. Like I've been training myself as an artist for a long time, and at some point, you kind of have to just kind of believe in yourself and just be able to just make the work without really knowing exactly what it means. And I think part of that is that um, we use language to describe the world, but even like language is kind of a primitive way of experiencing the world. Like we use words to talk about the experiences that we're having, but um, but the experience we're having hopefully is much deeper than just the language that we put on it. So does that make sense?
It does. It's actually exactly why I became an art historian, because I studied history in my undergraduate. And when I went to Spain and sort of looked around at the architecture that embodied the Christian, Jewish, and Arabic cultures that had been mixed together in the city of Sevilla, I didn't need a document. It was in the imagery. And it
Hmm.
became so, it occurred to me that it was in some ways a more pure way of understanding the past, because not to say that, art isn't also mitigated and mediated, but when you're writing something, you're basically always trying to convince somebody, and who's writing it, the people at the top of society are the ones writing it, and there's just always so much implicit bias. And of course I always look at things through a lens of history, but it's the same to me. Like, you look at this plate and you can't describe exactly everything that it means to you as an artist, and or to me as a viewer, but it gives me a feeling. And you have, like, as you're saying, your intuition as an artist led you to make it the way you did. So you don't need to know exactly like what it means, but you
Right.
know that it has power.
Yeah. So like you're looking at this piece, and if you're trying to describe it, like I think that um, it doesn't really, like, how do you describe, like, the colors are very washy and like kind of dreamy, like, but like there's multiple colors, like, but so trying to like talk about the piece and describe it so that someone can actually picture it in their head without seeing it is, like, to me it's like impossible. And part of it is like this, even the image of the piece is not really the piece. So how does the light reflect the glaze? It's a satin glaze, and there's some visual texture, but there's also a little bit of actual texture. And the piece isn't flat. It may appear flat here, but it's actually got a little curve to it. So it's sort of a bowl shape, plate shape that's coming out towards you. Um, and so I think all those things, that they have sort of these different feelings. Like if you were to turn these pieces around and look at the back, they're
Yeah.
actually more like a head shape. They're almost like a mask, so that they're actually kind of would cover your face. And so a lot of times when I'm forming these shapes, I'm actually looking at the back to see the curvature that's to make it feel like there's like actual like a face, um, which I don't have an image. It would have been kind of fun to kind of show
I
the
know
back
the
side of it.
back, at least you can see in this one, they all have sort of three little feet. This one's the most, I think, dramatic of a bowl shape.
Yeah, the
But
most curvy, the
um, what?
most voluptuous,
Yeah.
voluptuous.
Well, and this one I put next to the vessel form, because to me it's like the vessel is just changing into the plates that come. So this is the most like in between of those. And then I know that you were drawing, not necessarily, like I think from what I remember, your process isn't that you like make a drawing of the plate and then make that plate, but that you make drawings that then inform how the plates turn out. And there was a drawing in your studio of this black kind of cloud-like
Right.
form with the colored
Yeah.
tears coming out.
Yeah. So over the summer, I did a series of drawings, and I had a printout of something, but I don't have it here. I hadn't thought about that until just now. Yeah, so I did a series of drawings that a lot of these faces are based on, with the teardrops, and there were collages, so that the tears were actually cut paper on top of ink and gouache, and just like multiple eyes, but just different types of like sort of just playing around with different layers of information. And with two-dimensional work, I'm always trying to figure out how to make it more layered and three-dimensional, because I just love that three-dimensionality. So yeah, so in some ways, this show is inspired by those series of drawings, collages I did over the summer. Kind of, I love kind of going back to old work and trying to figure out how to reinvestigate or reinterpret ideas.
Mm.
And I think that really that process of kind of going back and kind of reinventing old work really does make the work have a richer, kind of more layered sensibility. And like as an artist, I always recommend that artists look back at some old work that they like and try to reinvent it. I think it's a really great process. And like part of making art is looking at art, and looking at other people's art. But I try to think of my old work as someone else's work, so I can actually have a fresh eye and look at it.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and then if you're going back to old ideas and kind of incorporating, you're always adding. So, I feel like that's the case with these plates, that the multi-layered meanings that you don't always even maybe remember something that was what you were thinking about 2 years ago, but it kind of through that intuitive process comes up. And then maybe you remember it a month after you made the piece because you thought it was about this current idea that you're thinking about.
Yeah, I always keep a sketchbook, and sometimes I found that like I have this great idea, and then I'll look at my sketchbook and I'll be like, hey, wait a minute, I had that idea before. So I'm always doing little drawings like this.
Yeah.
And so I have tons of these sketchbooks, and thinking about like here are some drawings that I did, and this is from not too long ago, in January, I guess. So, just it's a really great resource to have, like this information. But it's kind of funny. Like sometimes, like I'll end up making something that I think is brand new, and I actually had the idea like 5 years ago. That happens to me quite a bit. It's like, yes, I figured out something, and it's like, oh no, I figured that out like a long time ago.
Well,
So
that
anyway,
means it's a good idea.
yeah.
And
I've been
there's
thinking about it for years.
yeah.
before it
I
came
know
out.
some people have a few questions about technical stuff. I know someone asked about how they're hung. So each piece has kind of 3 little ceramic appendages on the back that we've wired so that they can be hung that way. And somebody was asking about surface technical for visual textures. It's surface of the clay, or do you apply underglaze and smooth surface and then sand the underglaze off?
Wait, say that again?
For visual texture, is it the surface of the clay, excuse me, or do you apply underglaze to basically smooth the surface and then sand the underglaze off. I think it was when we were looking at that multi-layered thing. I feel like you do all different things.
Well, there's there's no sanding involved. There's scraping. A lot of the techniques I use for drawing on clay are basically sgraffito and mishima. And what they basically mean is that you're actually incising the clay. So there's like the lines, the thin lines are actually engraved into the clay and then inlaid with color,
Mm,
usually black, but often, like there's different types of, and then, so in order to do that, I just slop on a bunch of color after I carve all the lines into the clay, and then I scrape off the surface. So the color just stays in the lines.
mhm.
And I really don't like sanding clay because sanding is really, it's like unhealthy in the ceramic studio.
Yeah.
And so I try to avoid that dry sandiness as much as possible. But then I do lots of different techniques, and I don't really feel like, my work is not technique driven. I use whatever technique I can figure out that makes it work.
Mhm.
And so like knowing the techniques is really helpful. And then if I need something after, oh, this will work better, then I do that. Um, so, I don't really feel like I'm, like like, I think that sometimes it's just nice to have like lots of different techniques and just be able to just use them like tools, and then, like layer them on top of each other. And this just, once again, it's like, like being somewhat fearless and just trying out stuff, and um, challenging yourself and realizing that you can make a mistake, and like that's okay. Sometimes your mistakes come out really good.
Yeah. Sometimes the hardest part is deciding when you're done.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's see. Lynn Dorman says, "Hi, Kevin. By the way, I'm sitting here with my wonderful Kevin Snipes cup that I purchased years ago at a small show in the Bonwitz Gallery. I too spent time in Cleveland at Case Western pursuing graduate studies, and spent time at the Cleveland Institute of
Oh
Art
yeah.
taking classes and viewing shows, which I loved. And just for everyone else's knowledge, I will copy the chat and send it to Kevin. So if you wrote notes, he'll be able to see it later. Stephanie thinks you should write a children's book. I think that would be great.
I thought about,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right.
Sometimes
Raymond. Oh, Raymond's talking about how drawing on curved forms is really difficult, and that he's been
mm,
working with his students on that, and that you have found a way to meld your drawing on the sides of your form in a unified whole, which is exciting. And let's see. Ed Richter says, I recently purchased your painting. Yes, no. Are you planning to do more painting?
oh, cool. Yeah, I'd love to do more painting. I need a painting studio. My clay studio is too small, and I feel like I need a specific place to actually be powerful in painting.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. Well, if anyone knows, you put it in the universe there, Kevin. So if anyone knows a
right.
good painting studio. Well, we're 6 minutes over normal, and I feel like we could just keep talking, but I also want to be cognizant of everyone's time. So I want to say thank you again to Kevin for your generosity of time and sharing what deep,
Thanks
wonderful
for coming.
thoughts. Yeah. Thanks,
Yeah.
everybody. Have a great
Yeah.
day.
Sure. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. See you soon. Thanks, Kevin. That was great.
Thanks, Jen.